Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to a rainy Tuesday night, and welcome to our St. Paul Learn with the League. I am Melissa Finnegan. I am a league member, and I will be moderating tonight's presentation, In the Weeds, Understanding Minnesota's New Cannabis Law. I want to give our thanks to the Roseville and White Bear Lake area leagues for their support of our programs. Please do feel free to check out their websites. Also, thanks to the St. Paul Neighborhood Network and Suburban Community Channels for taping and broadcasting our presentations. Our program is being recorded on Zoom. Feel free to type any questions you have during the presentation into the Q&A, and we will address them at the end of the talk. In a couple of days, you can check out our YouTube channel at League of Women Voters St. Paul to view this and previous programs. So let's get to tonight's feature. On May 21st of 2023, Minnesota became the 23rd state to legalize cannabis. And then after that law passed, cannabis use became legal on August 1st of 2023. However, I will note that official marijuana-based businesses have yet to be licensed in Minnesota. The 2023 law legalizing cannabis was extensive, and it set up a new state agency, the Office of Cannabis Management, along with several grant opportunities, a licensing structure for several new business types, and an expungement process for previous cannabis-related crimes. It is a brave new world. But it can also be confusing right now to understand what is legal and what's not as we as a state together navigate all of these changes. So tonight, to provide us with some clarity, is the Office of Cannabis Management Chief of Staff, Katie Knutson. Katie has had an extensive career in government and was previously Chief of Staff for the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. In addition, she managed government relations for the city of St. Paul under Mayor Chris Coleman. Katie has a master's in public health from the University of Minnesota and lives in St. Paul. And I will pass it over to Katie to give us tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Melissa. Hi, everyone. Katie Knutson, Chief of Staff for the Office of Cannabis Management. It is a joy to be with you all this evening. Somebody mentioned earlier that they were glad we were virtual tonight because of the rain, and I would have to second that, but I'm glad to be here with you all and look forward to having this conversation. So we will jump right in. I would anticipate that this is one of many conversations that you will have the opportunity to be a part of with the Office of Cannabis Management as we continue our outreach efforts throughout the state of Minnesota, as we continue to build a regulatory framework and launch the regulated market here in the state of Minnesota. Next slide. This is the current timeline broken down by quarters. I will note that we are halfway through quarter 2. And so what we are working on is an update to this timeline where we will move into quarter 1 of 2025, where we do anticipate having rules in place which will officially allow us to launch the market. You can find this timeline on the Office of Cannabis Management website under key dates. Next slide. So as Melissa mentioned, August 1st, we had full decriminalization of cannabis here in Minnesota. So what that means for individual Minnesotans is that you can have 2 ounces of flower in public. You can have 2 pounds of flower in a private residence. You can have 8 grams of cannabis concentrate. You can have edible products with a total of up to 800 milligrams of THC. And you can home grow 8 plants total with no more that are 4 that are mature or flowering. And then paraphernalia is also allowed. Next slide. So cannabis use by people 21 and older who choose to consume on private property, unless that owner prohibits it themselves, private residences, and places with approved licenses or event permits. However, we don't have those quite yet. Cannabis cannot be used when operating a motor vehicle or operating heavy machinery, and where smoking and vaping are prohibited under the Minnesota Clean Indoor Air Act. Next slide. Cannabis cannot be used or possessed at a public school or charter school and on school buses, at state correctional facilities, in locations where smoke, aerosol, or vapor of cannabis products could be inhaled by a minor, on federal property, including federally subsidized housing, and while on an employer's premises or operating an employer's vehicle, machinery, or equipment. I would also note that some of your local communities may also have local ordinances in place that prohibit smoking or vaping cannabis in public places, but you would need to check in with your local unit of government on their current status of rules. Next slide. So cannabis business is kind of the name of the game for the Office of Cannabis Management. We will release applications, we will issue licenses, and we are developing regulations outlining how and when businesses will participate in the new adult use industry in Minnesota. Over the last year, the office has been developing the regulatory framework for legal adult use cannabis and establishing processes and timelines to apply for licenses. Chapter 342 is what regulates adult use cannabis in the state of Minnesota. And that statute required all of the things we just outlined for cannabis businesses to be done by rule. And so if you're wondering what's taking so long, the Administrative Procedures Act in the state of Minnesota is thorough, and we are working on drafting rules that we will then continue to submit through the Administrative Procedures Act to put into place. And when rulemaking is finished and rules have been adopted and promulgated, we'll then be able to launch the market officially. Next slide. So when it comes to the legislation that was passed last year, one of the strongest underpinnings of that legislation is social equity. So the legislation prioritizes applications for businesses for people who are considered social equity applicants. Your screen shows you who those folks are under Chapter 342 as passed. I will note that these do get updated as soon as the bill that was passed by the House and Senate this year, House File 4757, the Office of Cannabis Management's first policy bill, makes a few tweaks to these, not to do anything substantial to changing these, but just making sure that the definitions are something that we can implement effectively. Next slide. One of the things to note of the Minnesota law is that it is considered one of the strongest for our partnerships with tribal nations in the nation. The Minnesota cannabis law allows the governor or his designee to enter into compacts with tribal governments to address jurisdictional issues related to the medical cannabis and adult use cannabis industries. The compacts are intended to enhance public health and safety, ensure a safe and well-regulated medical and adult use cannabis market, encourage economic development, and provide fiscal benefits to both tribal nations and the state. I can tell you that those compacting conversations are ongoing between the Office of Cannabis Management, the governor's office, and tribal nations throughout Minnesota. And we look forward to those coming online soon-ish. Next slide. Expungement, as Melissa mentioned, I am formerly a staff member of the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, and so the expungement portion of Chapter 342 was near and dear to my heart. And I was excited to read, I believe it was last week, that the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension has completed their work for the expungements that they hold on their system. So they have then notified the local law enforcement agencies that may also have records to expunge their associated records. The last part of expungement is will go to the Cannabis Expungement Board. That board has recently been announced. The Department of Corrections is the incubator agency for that board. And that board will work to review those who apply that have felony level cannabis on their record, to have those reviewed and determined if those should be expunged. So that process and work is ongoing. Next slide. Other agency programs, there are a lot of grant programs that were brought forward last year that are really exciting and cover kind of the broad swath of the cannabis world. The first one listed here is Can Renew, which is a grant program that actually kicks in 2026 when folks will be renewing their licenses. And it is a grant program that the Office of Cannabis Management is charged with implementing. We are currently hiring our first grant manager, and so look forward to bringing that person on board to stand up this program. This year, the Substance Use Treatment Recovery and Prevention grants did originally come over to the Office of Cannabis Management. The legislation this year did transition the oversight of those over to the Department of Health, where there is work already underway in that space. The Department of Health also has two other cannabis-related campaigns, youth prevention and education campaigns, a very significant public health focus, as well as education for people who are pregnant or may become pregnant or are breastfeeding. Next slide. MDH work, the MDH work continues, it never ends. As a public health master's holder, I very much appreciate the work of that agency. They are also training and educating about cannabis for the family home visiting program, and they have grants to local and tribal public health agencies to create and disseminate materials about safe use, prevention training, and community engagement. The Department of Labor and Industry is working on a dual training pipeline program to create earn and learn opportunities for employers to help meet cannabis workforce needs. They did certify 2 occupations recently, a cannabis worker and a laboratory worker. As we think about standing up the market, we know that laboratory needs and testing availability is going to be key. And so encouraging people to get into the laboratory space and that laboratory work, we identified as a strong need and are grateful for the partnership of DLI and the work that they're doing. And then finally, DEED has Can Startup, Can Navigate, and Can Train, 3 separate grant programs that are intended to support industry startup and Minnesota-based legal cannabis with technical assistance, loan capital, and workforce development training. I believe the total grant program for that is about $6 million. So not a lot, but certainly better than nothing. And we're grateful that the legislature was able to provide that funding last year so that there is some seed money to start Minnesota-based businesses for cannabis. Next slide. As I mentioned, rulemaking is the name of the game. So administrative rulemaking, the legislature directs the state agency to develop rules. There were a variety of rules that were items within the 342 that were designated to be done by rule. And so those are the things that we are working through. A rule is defined in law as every agency statement of general applicability and future effect adopted to implement or make specific the law enforced or administered by that agency or to govern its organization or procedure. That kind of just sounds like everything to me. Agencies only have rulemaking authority to the extent that the legislature grants it, and it is explicitly granted in Chapter 342 to the Office of Cannabis Management. If the rules we propose are exceed or in conflict with the legislative delegation of that authority, the administrative law judge will invalidate the rules. And so we're working hard to both identify the places in which we need to do rules and ensure that we don't overstep that mark as well. So the Administrative Procedures Act, as I mentioned, is what kind of formally outlines the process. It includes a notice requirement to the public and stakeholders, an opportunity for public comment, and then finally review by the administrative law judge. Once approved by the ALJ, rules are considered promulgated and adopted and have the effect of law. Next slide. So one thing you may note in Chapter 342.02 is that it grants OCM expedited rulemaking, which would make you feel as though we should be moving a lot faster. The changes that expedited means is that there is no initial request for public comment, and there is no statement of need and reasonableness or a sonar. And so there are pieces of the rulemaking process that in an expedited process get excused, but it does not actually speed up the process all that much. It does not assist the office in limiting the burden of developing and drafting the rules. The sheer scope and complexity of rules requires significant consultation and input from those outside of the Office of Cannabis Management. Many of you may have seen that we did multiple surveys out to the community. So while we weren't required to do community engagement, we did think that it was really important. There was a lot of expertise that we could glean from folks. And so we did do a lot of surveys out to the public on a variety of topics, from cultivation to medical rules, to understand kind of people's input into those specific areas as we were drafting those rules. We also reached out to our state agency partners that had expertise, whether it be the Pollution Control Agency, the DLI, the Department of Economic Development, and the Department of Health, to understand their perspective on some of the rulemaking that they really had expertise in from a topic perspective. Next slide. So these are the big things that we're working on doing rulemaking for. We have Chapter 342 as drafted has 16 license types. Again, House File 4757, which we are hoping the governor will sign any day, does reduce those by 3. And so reduces that to 13 license types that require forms, procedures, disclosures, felony disqualifications, and limits on the licenses held. Also, social equity considerations, manufacturing and retail, both facilities and operations, packaging and labeling. I will note that the bill this year does make some updates to what is prohibited in packaging and labeling, really focusing on limiting what could be enticing to children. Testing, laboratory approval, sampling protocols and standards. An expedited complaint process for local governments is also required by rule. A statewide monitoring system, which is affectionately referred to as the seed to sale system. So the law requires that any seed that goes into the ground that will eventually be sold into the market is tracked through that seed to sale system, so that if we need to do any sort of public health measure, we're able to do that because we are able to track that product. Environmental controls, including odor limits, water use, energy use, solid waste disposal, use of pesticides and fertilizers, along with many others. So as we noted, it is a very extensive list of things that we are actively drafting and working to incorporate into the rulemaking process. Next slide. So as I mentioned, rulemaking is what needs to be in effect before licenses can be issued. So that needs the ALJ approval with forms and procedures. It needs to have public health and consumer safety concerns, inspection and regulatory enforcement criteria development, and no licenses can be issued before those criteria are approved and enforced. Next slide. Ooh, sorry. I don't know if you heard that. That was a big clap of thunder. Ways to engage with the Office of Cannabis Management. Like I said at the beginning, I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a conversation. I do look forward to hearing from all of you your questions with where we're at, where we're going, what's confusing about what's happening currently in the world of cannabis in the state of Minnesota. Other ways that you can engage with us is via our website. We do have a monthly OCM Insider newsletter I would encourage you to sign up for. As was done for this event, you can also request an OCM speaker for any future events you or another organization you are a part of might be happening. Participate in a future OCM webinars. We will be doing another webinar, kind of post-session wrap-up update that will be coming and announced shortly. Again, sign up for that insider newsletter and you'll hear the date and time when we are able to announce that. And then you can participate in any future rulemaking comment periods, which will include the 30-day comment period when the rules are sent to the administrative law judge. And I think then I just have some resources on the next slide for all of you, ways to get in touch. Both at OCM and the Department of Health. And just very grateful for the time to be here with you all this evening.
Thank you, Katie. That was great. Appreciate it. We do have a few questions coming in through the Q&A. The first one being, will potency be addressed in the rulemaking process?
That's a really great question. So we think about potency in particular as we think about those who are using medical cannabis in particular. We know that especially if you have cancer and you have been using medical cannabis for a while, you may need more or stronger doses. And so we certainly anticipate that as we are drafting rules, we will take into consideration those potency pieces. I can't say for sure how that will be done in the rulemaking process, but it is something that we got over 3,000 responses to our survey just on medical cannabis, and potency was absolutely one of the big pieces that was raised in those survey responses.
And is that something that will also be required to be on like product labeling, numbers of doses or whatever, so that, you know, if you buy an entire cookie and a serving is a quarter of the cookie, how many of us actually know that?
That's a great question. Packaging and labeling will absolutely be a significant part of rulemaking and something that we are taking very seriously. As I mentioned, the statute did update this year. It already had a lot of things that we had to take into consideration about what could or couldn't be used on packaging and labeling, but also what needs to be included in packaging and labeling. To your point, Melissa, about how many milligrams am I eating? How many servings are in my milligrams? And that information will absolutely be required. That is limited already by law, which is also helpful, especially as we have some of these lower dose products that are currently out in the market. There is, what is helpful in the packaging and labeling field is that there is some standards that exist nationally that are a base that we can use and that are being used kind of no matter what state you go to. And so that standardization has been very helpful for us as we work to develop those rules.
Learning from those 22 states who went before us.
That's right.
Given all the pressure on our water systems, the rivers, the aquifers, contaminants, and knowing that that's in sort of the rulemaking process, can you speak to the impact that cannabis could have on growing organizations and their use of water?
I'm not that much of a specialist, so I can't speak specifically to it, but I can say that in our conversations with the Pollution Control Agency, as we thought about this section of rules, we thought about, did it make sense to do special rules for this cannabis space and these cannabis growers, or did it make more sense to figure out what rules that currently exist in those different spaces that you named that we would then apply to the cannabis industry, if that lens shift makes sense. And so we've been having really robust conversations with our partner agencies in that space, and are certainly tracking not only water usage, but energy usage as well, especially for cultivation facilities.
Nice. Well, maybe pivoting to something that you do have expertise in, given your history with public safety, there's no breathalyzer for
Right.
cannabis.
Yeah.
So how are like highway patrol and, how are we going to be able to tell if somebody is under the influence while driving?
That's a great question. There is no per se limit, right? So alcohol is easy. It's 0.08 and you're either at it, below it, or above it. And that's not true for cannabis. And part of that is because of the way that cannabis is taken in and through your body differently than alcohol is. And so, but what we do know is that intoxication is intoxication, and under the influence is under the influence. And so there are a variety of field tests that can be done. They are more time consuming than a breathalyzer, but you see them right now with alcohol too, right? It's the walk the line and touch your nose and all of those different tests that have long been standardized for law enforcement across the nation. And they're able to use those to determine if someone is driving under the influence, whether that is alcohol, cannabis, prescription opioids, or a combination of the three.
Okay. We got a lot of good questions coming in. So pivoting to your public health expertise, just going to run the gamut here. We have seen legislation on vaping manufacturers to address the candy flavors for nicotine vape products. Do you foresee down the line any sort of impact on flavored gummies or things that are basically just candy for cannabis?
That was a robust conversation that happened at the legislature this year. There is certainly an effort in the community to have conversations about what flavored products and how they appeal to children. And so that conversation happened across a variety of committees in the legislature this year. I think that one of the challenges that was identified is when it comes to things like medical cannabis and cannabis as medicine, some of those flavorings are really important. And so figuring out what that balance is will, I believe, continue to be a conversation in the years and sessions to come.
And is that where some of the packaging regulations can come into play to make the packaging non-enticing to children, even if the product itself would be enticing?
That's 100% right, Melissa. It's like you also know about public health.
Maybe just a little. Have we gotten good information from other states that have had legality for far longer than we have on things like public intoxication, driving under the influence, kids getting the product, becoming ill? I'm not going to use the word learnings because I hate that word, but that's just the general idea. What can we gather from other states to help us be better at implementation?
Lots, so much. Every day I learn something new from one of the other states that have legalized. We are a member of the national organization, which is called CANRA. And what's exciting is that they're actually coming to Minnesota for the annual meeting the first week of June. And so we will continue our learnings at that meeting. In addition to the literal daily conversations we are having with the other member states about everything and anything under the sun related to cannabis, how people are adapting and adopting variations to their rules, how they rolled out their market is in particular something that we're paying attention to right now as we think about staging our market. And it is a great network. And I'm always so grateful that every time we ask a question, we get lots of responses from other states to say how they approached it, and what they learned when they did it the way that they did it, and if they were doing it now, how they do it differently.
Nice. I didn't even know there was a national organization. That's awesome.
It's actually international. Even the Netherlands participates.
Oh, hey. So I know there's been a really big focus on social equity in this legislation. One thing I haven't heard a lot about is what steps, if any, are being taken to protect immigrant populations from negative consequences of contact with cannabis, given that it's still federally controlled. And so if they get involved in this market, that could eventually lead to deportation or denial of citizenship.
That's right. And I think that that education component is really important, and one that we work with a variety of stakeholders to make sure that communities understand what that implication could be for them based on their unique circumstances. I think that there are lots of nonprofits and different advocate organizations that are working hard to make sure that that message is out there, that education is occurring, and that as the federal government continues to assess how it views and interacts with cannabis, that will also continue to evolve.
So I know the BCA is doing the automatic expungements or have done them all. And then there's the board for the felonies. Following up a little bit on that immigration question, is there a way for people to get those expungement records? Because to be naturalized, you have to report all your convictions, even if they've been expunged. So that might be a follow-up question to get to later. I don't think immigration attorney is in your background.
That's one thing that I haven't done. I did not go to law school. And so I do not have a great answer to that question. I think that is a really good question for a place like the BCA, who I'm sure would be happy to take that question and have an answer out for how people could consider it. You are always able to get access to your records. They are something that you are entitled to under Chapter 13. And so certainly you could make that request, but also just a general question for the BCA that I'm sure they'd be happy to answer.
Nice. So I think part of a lot of the confusion here is we keep hearing that the market's not stood up yet, legal places aren't there, but I can literally go around the corner to my house and there's a business selling cannabis products. So can you talk us through a little bit, like, you can go buy a THC beverage, you can go buy gummies right now. What's the difference between those products and what's coming?
So those products should all be—
I like that caveat,
should all be below 0.03% total THC. So THC is what gives you that magical effect. And so those products should all be under 0.03. They are considered lower dose hemp derived products. So the federal definition of hemp is that 0.03 distinction of the amount of THC in the plant. And so you should be buying those products should be under that 0.03, because they should all be coming from a hemp plant, which would have started at below 0.03. And so we are working with the Department of Health on enforcement and education efforts to make sure to make sure that the products that are out there are following the packaging and labeling requirements of for lower dose hemp products, and that they meet that THC threshold. But that's the distinction. It's the amount of THC that's in them. And right now it's low. And once we stand up a regulated adult use market, it will be products that come from cannabis plants that can be above 0.03 and have higher potency.
Gotcha. So here's a question that's been noodling around in my brain. It's currently legal to possess flower, right?
Yes.
But it's not legal to sell flower.
That's correct.
So how are people getting flower that's legal to possess?
So you can home grow your own,
Okay.
and you can have up to 8 plants. 4 of them can be flowering at a time. And then let me go back to one of my beginning slides, because I do not want to misspeak about the different ways that people are able to possess. Where did that go? I thought we had And they can be getting it from tribal nations, right? So there are 2 tribal nations
Oh,
that have retail stores open. And so if you go to Red Lake or White Earth Nation, you are able to purchase cannabis that you could then possess as well.
okay. Okay. I saw recently in the news the federal government's taking action to reschedule cannabis as not a level 1 drug. Does that have any impact on our law at all?
Um, I think more to come. I think our early analysis is not really, because it will still remain treated more like a prescription drug at that point instead of a controlled substance. It changes a little bit and it helps. Mostly what it does, my understanding is that it will help open up capital, because it helps reduce the barriers that some financial institutions feel because cannabis is currently a Schedule 1 drug. And so when they change that definition, that those financial institutions kind of feel more confident entering into that space.
That makes sense. Thinking more on the federal level, and as more states move in this direction, I don't think we're the most recent. I think maybe 1 or 2 followed after us. Do you think will it be safe to fly with your gummies if you've got layover in a non-cannabis state? Like, what's sort of the rules now of going from a legal state to a legal state?
That's a great question for your lawyer, which I'm not.
That's fair. Other questions that are coming in from folks as I scroll down here. So as it, is legal now, there are people who may have used it back in the 70s when it was more of a different product. Do you think people understand now sort of how cannabis has evolved from maybe what they used in their wild youth?
I think what I hear in my conversations with folks is that as they have felt better about re-engaging in choosing to consume, now that it is legal in the state of Minnesota again, is they learn quickly the way that that plant has evolved since the 1970s.
Okay. I know one of the criticisms when this law was being debated was that it was just a cash grab. And now we will be getting tax revenue from this new product, and other states have done a lot of different things with that tax revenue. Does Minnesota have a plan for what it plans to spend that money on?
That's a great question. And what I would say is what I appreciate about the way that the Minnesota legislature approached the Office of Cannabis Management is that they gave us a general fund appropriation to pay for our work. And so the funds that we take in, whether that be in application fees, licensing fees, or any fines that we levy, go directly back into the general fund to be used for any variety of priorities that the legislature may deem in the budget years to come. And as well as tax revenue, with the exception, of course, being that some of that tax revenue does get redistributed to the local governments in the form of aid.
Nice. Yes. I know several local governments are already starting to think about what they could do with that revenue. Do you know, as more people begin using this product, have we done any additional training to hospitals and medical providers about how cannabis overuse, intoxication, poisonings? I know a friend was wondering if a veterinarian knew for, pets who get into products, if we've done that level of education.
I don't know about that level of education, but what I do know is that the number of 911 calls, ambulance calls for service, and trips to the ERs has risen significantly since legalization. And so I certainly think that that is a space where education is warranted and would be well received as people continue to understand the different ways in which cannabis interacts with a person's body.
And thinking about how cannabis reacts with a person's body. So medical cannabis has been legal in Minnesota now for a decade. Is OCM going to regulate medical cannabis? Is that going to stay with the Department of Health? How does that sort of interplay work out?
So we are excited to welcome the Office of Medical Cannabis into the Office of Cannabis Management, July 1st of 2024, as soon as the governor signs House File 4757. So that was one of the changes that we brought forward this year. They were always going to come, but under the current law, they come March of 2025. And we felt like it was really important that we integrate as soon as possible in order to continue to build out the infrastructure of the agency, as well as ensure that any education and enforcement actions that we take are well integrated and align into the agency that we want to become, using the mechanisms currently authorized for the Office of Medical Cannabis, OMC to OCM. People were very creative with those.
Yeah, that's not going to be confusing for anybody with dyslexia at all.
Well, I never say it wrong, so.
No, of course not. So I know several medical conditions have been approved for medical cannabis, but there are some reports going the other way. So reports that like heavy cannabis use can aid in the development of schizophrenia. Has there been any discussion of how like that public health issue would be addressed, or any other conversation about the downsides of cannabis use?
I think that one of the things that the Department of Human Services, I believe, but please don't quote me, this is being recorded and I'm out of luck, is first use psychosis episodes with the use of cannabis. So I do think in 342 as it was drafted, there was consideration given to those issues, and direction and funding given to the Department of Human Services and maybe the Department of Health, and then of course the governor's substance use advisory council exists and will lean into that space as well.
Okay. Thinking about home grow that people can do right now, how is that tracked and monitored? And how will it be regulated if somebody is growing more than they're allowed 8 plants for flowering at a time? You really got to have a gardening degree to pull this off.
It's not easy. I have learned that. I think that, the home grow program will be something that we work not only from a regulatory agency standpoint, but with our local government and local law enforcement partners to ensure that people are following and acting within the law. It will be up to kind of individuals and local governments themselves to determine how and what action they want to take for someone in their community that is home growing at levels not allowed by the law.
And if you are home growing and you sell some of what you grow to your friends, is that allowed under the law?
That's a good question that I would need to follow up with you on. I don't want to speak wrong.
That's fair. Can you tell us a little bit more about the education campaigns for youth and prevention and substance treatment?
They are owned by the Department of Health, and so I would have to defer to them as they work and develop those programs. I know that they are really engaged in the topic and very interested in getting those programs stood up as soon as they're able, because they recognize the importance, as do we, of ensuring that we're doing what we can, because we know that it's the education campaigns that are going to help actually make a difference in youth engagement in the cannabis space. And so are really excited for the Department of Health to stand that program up.
And thinking especially about the substance treatment grants and education, Does any of this funding go to substance use disorder treatment assistance for people who do start using unhealthy amounts of cannabis? Are we investing in that?
So there is significant funding in substance use disorder. How that grant program will be detailed out, I think, is still to come. That is the grant program that was transferred to the Department of Health this year. And so I know that they, along with Jeremy Drucker, the head of the Governor's Substance Use Advisory Council, has really put some thought into the right combination of efforts that grant program could be used for to make the biggest impact for Minnesotans.
Great. I think we've just got one. Oh, I was gonna say we have one final question and then another one popped up. Do you know, have Hazelden or other substance use programs, do they support legalization? Were they in favor of it, or do you remember that conversation?
This is what's interesting about my path here is that I actually was not really engaged when House File 100 or Chapter 342 was passed last year. And so I can't speak to who was for and who was against legalization to that level of specificity, unfortunately.
That makes sense. Final question, because there's so much effort and rulemaking and everything in front of the Office of Cannabis Management. When do you think we could expect to see, legal cannabis businesses licensed in Minnesota?
Yeah, so we are really we're on track, and we are excited to be able to launch the regulated market in early 2025. We look forward to putting the kind of what we're calling the director's cut of the rules out publicly this summer to make sure that people get an opportunity to review and provide comment on them as they move through the process, the administrative rules, procedures through the rest of this year.
Right. And eventually you guys will have a director, right?
Eventually we will have we have a director. We have an interim director. Charlene
Right.
Briner is doing a fantastic job. We're grateful for her willingness to lead us and the office. And at some point in time, we will have a permanent director named.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'm going to make this one our final question. They do keep coming in, but we are starting to come up on our time. Is it part of the role of the Office of Cannabis Management or the Office of Medical Cannabis to stay updated on medical and scientific research related to the consumption or development of cannabis?
Absolutely. That is one of the things that the Office of Medical Cannabis is well known for. And if you read the paper from the FDA about the rescheduling of cannabis, you will note that Minnesota is widely used because of our robust data and research that we have instituted in the state, and that we look forward to welcoming and integrating into the Office of Cannabis Management and continuing in a broader sense into the adult use market as well as the medical market as we build up the cannabis market in Minnesota.
Well, wonderful. As we wrap up here, Katie, I want to give you the opportunity. You got a bunch of really active citizens here. Is there a call to action? Is there anything Legal Women Voters members should do to help educate the public?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, please sign up to engage with the office. Please sign up to get our emails and our newsletters. I promise we won't spam you, but we will provide you with the most up-to-date information, and it's the best way to follow along with where we are in the process. We hope that as we have now established this relationship, that we can continue to come back to you all as a place that we can seek guidance, feedback, comments, questions from, so we continue to develop our materials and our outreach and develop the market that we're hitting the mark and we're getting Minnesotans what they need. And you will certainly be an organization that we rely on for that.
Absolutely. As you can see, there's a lot of questions and a lot of interest and a lot of good thoughts going into this. So thank you to Katie. We thank you to our viewers. We hope that you enjoyed your evening here with us on this rainy Tuesday. Just a few follow-up slides as League of Women Voters. In case you hadn't heard yet, 2024 is going to be a giant of a voting year. So for your reference, here are two major upcoming election dates. The St. Paul League will be running candidate forums all during the month of September, so please watch them in person or view the online recordings. Vote 411 and our website at lwvsp.org. We'll have other information, and we are here to help everybody understand this process. The League is fully committed to its nonpartisan nature when educating the public on candidates, as well as promoting reliable and secure elections for our country. For more than 100 years, we study issues, we take positions, and we take action. And of course, you can find us on the web. St. Paul, State, and the National League of Women Voters all have interesting information on our websites, and we'd love to have you check it out. Finally, thanks again to Roseville and White Bear Lake leagues for their support, as well as thank you to SCC and SPNN as well. Thank you for joining us tonight, and have a lovely evening.